The forest was cold when they entered, the kind of cold that seeped past jackets and into the joints, carrying the faint scent of wet earth and something older, metallic. The sun hung low, a sickle of orange behind black trunks, and already the shadows were stretching in strange, precise angles. At first, it went unnoticed. They hiked along the narrow path, the sound of their boots absorbed into the damp, loamy ground. Birds were absent. The usual forest chorus was silenced. Even the wind seemed tentative, brushing the pines without rustling their needles. "I thought we were taking the Eastern Trail," Mara said, squinting at the map under her flashlight. The beam trembled across the gnarled roots. Leo adjusted the pack on his shoulders. "We are. Just keep moving." His voice cracked, swallowed immediately by the thick air. It was when they stopped to rest, knees pressed into moss, that they noticed. A shadow stretched from a nearby birch, long and angular, but its tip didn't fall where it should. Pointed toward them. Leo jerked his flashlight, swinging it over the forest floor, tracing the shadow back to its source. The angle twisted unnaturally, defying the beam. "Wait! Shadows don't do that," Mara whispered. Her words were cautious, as if speaking too loudly might draw the dark in closer. They moved again. Every tree's shadow, maple, fir, cedar, shifted subtly but inevitably, converging toward their positions. At first, they assumed it was perspective, some trick of light over uneven terrain. But the effect persisted. When they stepped off the trail to test it, the shadows adjusted. When they huddled together beneath a cliff of moss-covered stones, the black shapes leaned, a muted gravity pulling them in. By the time they tried the campfire, the oddness had grown heavier. Leo lit the match, small sparks blossoming into a trembling flame. It painted the clearing in amber, revealing the familiar shapes of the forest. Yet even under firelight, the shadows writhed toward them. It was as if the fire itself were a weak sun in a miniature world, unable to repel some other rule, some ancient geometry that refused to bend. They tested it methodically. First a flashlight. The beam created halos of brightness, but every dark line still pointed at them. Then moonlight filtered through the thin canopy. Each branch's shadow extended like a finger. They marked positions with sticks, measuring angles. At every relocation, the shadows corrected themselves, converging precisely. The air shifted as night deepened. A subtle, almost imperceptible anomaly made their stomachs twinge. The sounds of their steps no longer echoed naturally. A rock fell under Mara's boot, yet the thud came after the echo, delayed. Occasionally, the path would fork, but each turn seemed to double back, returning them toward the same stretch of trees. Depth itself felt uncertain, as if distance and space were pliable. "This is wrong," Mara said, voice barely above a shiver. Leo bit his lip, scanning the darkness beyond the fire's edge. "It's like the forest's bending. Not alive, just," he gestured vaguely, "just a rule we don't understand." And that was when the first whisper of comprehension settled on them. The shadows weren't random, weren't alive. They were a statement of law. Some ancient, precise force that had taken root long before maps or towns existed, dictating angles and light. They remembered something Mara half remembered from a forgotten folklore lecture about an old surveyor's legend. A land where no one could stand unseen, where geometry itself punished trespassers. Hours passed in tense observation. They moved in small circles back and forth, measuring, testing. At some point, they realized the trees themselves were aligned with an impossible symmetry. Not radial or grid-like, but subtle, as if each trunk and branch were positioned to create a cumulative vector. Every shadow converged toward certain coordinates. Not them personally, but the small clearing where they had camped, the place where the map had suggested no notable feature. And then, almost imperceptibly, the forest went silent. The fire crackled without hiss, insects stopped buzzing, the occasional drip of water from leaves halted. Even their breathing seemed out of sync, uneven with the air around them. Shadows became sharper, colder. The forest was waiting, or rather, the geometry was. They stood at the edge of the clearing, facing the densest grouping of shadows, when Mara noticed the distortion in perspective more clearly. Branches that appeared close were farther than they should have been. Trunks that seemed parallel converged in impossible angles. Depth had been lying to them all along. "Do you feel that?" she asked, voice trembling. "Like gravity, but wrong?" Leo nodded, unable to articulate the sensation. A low pressure hung in the air, pressing around them from every side. The shadows were no longer extensions of the trees. They were vectors of some unseen force. Not alive, not sentient, but inexorable. They considered leaving the fire, retreating to the trail. But each step carried them not away, but along the curvature of some hidden law. The further they walked, the more the angles corrected, pulling them back to the center of the anomaly. Even the moonlight, high and pure, failed to untangle the lines. Finally, after hours of testing, calculation, and terror, they accepted it. The forest was not alive, but the land itself obeyed a rule older than any living creature. Shadows always pointed toward certain coordinates. Ancient markers, perhaps, or remnants of a long-forgotten geometric experiment. A site where reality had been subtly warped. They had stumbled into a locus where physics didn't follow the rules they knew, a place designed or cursed to always reveal where they stood. Leo dropped to his knees beside a tree, brushing the moss with numb fingers. The shadows clung to the firelight, stretching like black veins across the ground. Mara moved beside him, staring at the convergence point, the center of all the pointing lines. And then they understood simultaneously without speaking. This was not punishment, not conscious danger. It was simply truth. The land could not lie. Wherever you stood, it would show you, expose you, reduce you to a single coordinate in its eternal pattern. The wind rose suddenly, but the forest remained impossibly still. Their shadows, perfectly aligned with the otherworldly geometry, stretched longer than the trees themselves, extending toward the center of the clearing like hands of a clock pointing to midnight. They stayed huddled together, watching, understanding, and then the final image settled into their vision. The convergence point glimmered faintly under the moon, not with fire, but with a quiet phosphorescence that hinted at some buried, unbroken order. Their shadows, obedient and inevitable, pointed at it. No scream, no entity, no attack. Only the realization that the forest, or rather the law it embodied, could never be outrun. And as the fire sputtered, leaving them in moonlight alone, the shadows continued their silent alignment, stretching with impossible precision, revealing a truth older than any human observer could bear. In this place, you are never hidden. The trees remained silent, the air remained cold, and the shadows always pointed toward them. The forest was quieter than they had ever known it. Even the usual night insects seemed muted, their chirps scattered or absent entirely. They set up the tent in a small clearing, pressed between two fallen pines, the ground soft with damp moss. The nylon shivered under the light breeze, pale moonlight pooling in uneven patches across the fabric. They crawled inside, each settling into their sleeping bags. The night air was cold, carrying a damp, earthy scent that clung to clothes and skin. Leo zipped the tent, the sharp sound of the slider echoing unnaturally in the stillness. "Feels different," Mara whispered, adjusting her sleeping bag. Her voice barely rose above the soft sighing of the wind. Leo didn't answer. The silence was already pressing. Moments passed. Then, without warning, the tent fabric bulged inward. A smooth, rounded protrusion pushed against the thin nylon, shifting as if something soft but unyielding pressed from the outside. Leo froze. Mara turned her head. "It's just wind," Leo muttered, though even to himself it sounded unconvincing. The breeze was too light to create such a distinct shape. The bulge didn't retreat. It lingered, slow and deliberate, and as their eyes adjusted to the dim glow of the headlamp, it took on a suggestion of form, a face. Not fully human, not fully visible, but contours that resembled eyes, a nose, a mouth. The movement was subtle, almost imperceptible, but every few seconds it shifted, pressing closer, as if peering at them. Mara swallowed and touched the nylon. "I don't see anyone out there," she whispered, tracing the surface with her fingertips. The fabric was cold, taut, unyielding except for the bulge itself. No hand, no branch, nothing. Leo pressed his hand against the same area. No wind, no animal, nothing. He lifted the tent flap, peering into the moonlit clearing. The forest stretched away in all directions, deep and shadowed. Nothing moved. Not a bird, not a rabbit, not even a stray leaf. The silence was complete. It pressed against them, making every breath feel loud and intrusive. Their own heartbeats echoed in their ears. They returned to the sleeping bags, though neither felt warm. Every few minutes, the bulge returned. Always in the same area, always hovering in the same smooth, face-like outline. They pressed against it together, feeling the taut nylon stretch, trying to discern any tangible object. Nothing gave. Mara lit a flashlight and directed it across the tent from the inside. The beam revealed the same shape, softened by the fabric but unmistakable. A facial outline, features suggested rather than defined. Every adjustment of the light shifted the shadows within the bulge, twisting the shape subtly, as though it existed in 3 dimensions just beyond comprehension. "Maybe it's some kind of optical trick," Leo said, his voice tight. "Heat, condensation, our shadows." He reached outside, shining the light along the ground, scanning the clearing. The moonlight threw uneven shadows, but none of them could produce a bulge in the tent from that angle. They tested it, pushed from outside, prodded with sticks, circled the tent to examine its surface. Every effort was met with the same ambiguous result. The bulge returned, resilient, persistent. It pressed inward as if aware of their inspection, though no intelligence could be proven. Hours passed. The temperature dropped, cold creeping through the nylon and into their sleeping bags. Their breaths condensed, forming small clouds inside the tent. They spoke in whispers, fewer words with each repetition, drawn into the gravity of the quiet. Mara pressed her forehead against the fabric. The bulge shifted subtly, distorting like it was examining her. The suggestion of eyes met her own, but she knew they weren't eyes, not really. Still, her skin crawled with the illusion of recognition. "This isn't right," she murmured. "Yeah," Leo agreed. "I don't know what physics allows this." He drew the sleeping bag tighter around his shoulders. "I've never felt the forest like this." Outside, the geometry of the campsite was off. Stumps that should have cast familiar shadows instead leaned at impossible angles. The moss-covered rocks appeared to shift in size as the moon moved, receding and approaching as though depth itself had been rewritten. Their tent, a small nylon rectangle, seemed to occupy a slight displacement from the rest of the clearing, isolated, targeted. They tried to sleep. Neither could. Every time their eyelids drooped, the bulge returned, moving faintly, stretching and twisting against the fabric. They felt as if the tent itself had become a membrane between 2 realities, one normal and one warped, and that something from the warped side was always present, always pressing to be acknowledged. At some point, Leo whispered, "Maybe it's a distortion of the material, the fabric amplifying pressure or wind patterns." He had no conviction in the explanation. Mara shook her head. "Nothing explains this." Her fingertips traced the bulge again. It was firm beneath the nylon, but not rigid. Soft, yielding, almost alive in texture. But not alive. They had already ruled out life. The anomaly belonged to some physical law they could not perceive, some ancient rule of that clearing they had stumbled into. A sudden chill descended. The forest, already mute, seemed to stretch farther than it should. Trees that had been on the perimeter of their vision now towered impossibly close, or perhaps the clearing itself had shrunk. The tent was no longer a simple rectangle. It had become a vessel, a tiny island surrounded by space that did not follow human logic. Hours, or was it minutes, passed. Their senses became untrustworthy. The bulge remained, its subtle movements hypnotic. They pressed against it together, hands overlapping, feeling the suggestion of a face but never a fully realized one. It responded mechanically, physically, but in a way they could not explain, as if the laws governing its existence were parallel to their own. Finally, Mara spoke. Maybe it's not a face. Maybe it's us. Something in the clearing reflecting, distorting, projecting us back. Leo remained silent, staring at the distorted shape, imagining the tent without the bulge. Impossible. The forest's geometry held it in place, as though that small rectangle of nylon had become the center of an impossible lens. They dared not leave the tent. Every attempt to step outside resulted in a spatial uncertainty. The ground felt wrong beneath their boots. The familiar trail vanished, replaced by angles and distances that defied memory. The forest had not moved. They had. Morning approached, though no change in light reassured them. Moonlight waned, replaced by a gray, overcast dawn that did not warm. The bulge persisted, faint now but undeniable. Shadows within it suggested eyes, though none existed. Every line of nylon pressed inward in harmony with the impossible geometry outside. Mara pressed her cheek to the fabric one last time, feeling the soft, impossible curve. Leo followed, hands flat against the taut surface. And then the realization struck them simultaneously, with clarity they could not ignore. The forest had never been quiet, and the tent had never been empty. It was not a predator. It was not a spirit. It was a manifestation of the clearing's geometry, a spatial law that had existed before humans ever wandered here. The face, suggested, ambiguous, uncanny, was not a being. It was the clearing observing itself through the membrane of their presence. The tent was a lens, and they had been caught in the focus. They could leave, they knew, but the clearing would always remember, always distort, always press back. Even as they unzipped the tent and crawled out, the bulge's shape lingered, the outline of a face carved into the nylon by some law of physics they could not comprehend. In the pale light of dawn, they stood among the leaning trees, the mossy stones, the impossibly angled stumps, and understood. Nothing in the clearing obeyed expectation. The bulge, the face, the pressure against the nylon, it would remain. The forest had no intent, no malice. But it had laws older than human fear, and they had glimpsed them. The tent fabric hung limp in the morning breeze, yet as they packed it away, the faintest suggestion of inward pressure remained. Not a hand, not a face, but a reminder. The clearing was still watching, calculating, pressing against the boundaries of their perception. And they would carry the memory of that bulge forever, the soft, impossible curve of something not alive, not dead, but entirely real in a way their minds could not fully process.